The studio lights burned bright, cutting through the thick air of anticipation. Cameras rolled, microphones hissed, and the nation leaned in. Alan Dershowitz sat with the calm arrogance of a man certain of his intellect, lips curled in a knowing smirk. Across from him, Jasmine Crockett adjusted her mic's steady hands, sharp eyes, a quiet storm brewing beneath her composure. The host's voice faded into the background, the real show was about to begin. Dershowitz leaned forward, his words dripping with the practiced confidence of decades in televised debate. He aimed low, condescending, trying to box her into silence. For a brief moment, it worked. The room froze, unsure how she'd respond. And then, Crockett exhaled. That calm breath, almost imperceptible, signaled something seismic. She looked up, eyes locked on him, and the energy shifted. Viewers watching live felt it before they understood it. This wasn't going to be another polite exchange of opinions. It was about to become a moment that cut through the noise, a televised reckoning where intellect met audacity and only one would walk away unshaken. No one in that room expected what happened next. But by the end, everyone would remember her name. This wasn't just a debate, it was a line drawn in history. Moments like this define who's really paying attention. Don't just watch change happen, be part of it. Hit like, subscribe, and join the movement that refuses to stay silent when power tries to silence reason. Alan Dershowitz has long been a towering figure in American law, a Harvard professor emeritus, courtroom legend, and defender of high-profile clients whose names shaped the political headlines of entire decades. For years, his intellect was beyond reproach, his influence unshakable. But somewhere along the line, admiration turned to controversy. His staunch defenses of figures like Donald Trump blurred the line between principle and partisanship, transforming him from celebrated scholar to lightning rod. To his critics, he became a symbol of the establishment elite, brilliant, yes, but out of touch, more invested in winning arguments than protecting truth. To his supporters, he remained the last of an old guard, unafraid to challenge the woke tide. Either way, his reputation carried the weight of history. Then came Jasmine Crockett. Young, sharp, and fiercely articulate, she represented everything the new generation of political leadership stood for: direct, unapologetic, and unwilling to bow to institutional arrogance. A former public defender turned congresswoman, she didn't inherit her platform, she built it from the ground up, case by case, fight by fight. Her brand of justice wasn't theoretical, it was lived. Where Dershowitz argued from the ivory tower, Crockett spoke from the trenches of courtroom reality, her words drawn from the lives of people the system too often forgot. It was inevitable that their paths would collide. The stage was set on a primetime broadcast, billed as a discussion on constitutional integrity and the future of American democracy, but from the start, it was never just about legal interpretation. It was about who gets to define justice in modern America and whose voices get dismissed when they try. Dershowitz entered the studio with the air of a man certain of his dominance. He debated senators, dismantled journalists, and mentored generations of lawyers who hung on his every word. He saw Crockett as yet another ambitious politician trying to score points on TV. But Crockett had done her homework. She knew she wasn't just debating a man, she was confronting an ideology. One built on gatekeeping, on the belief that wisdom only counts when it comes from men in old books and older institutions. As they took their seats under the glare of studio lights, the contrast couldn't have been sharper. He, the relic of a legal era that rationalized power; she, the voice of a country demanding accountability from those same corridors of power. He wielded citations and precedent like armor. She came armed with truth and clarity, cutting through rhetoric with the precision of lived experience. The topic that night: Supreme Court ethics and Trump's trials, was gasoline waiting for a spark. Dershowitz began as he always did, invoking the Constitution as though it were his personal scripture, warning against what he called the mobification of justice. Crockett listened, her eyes steady, waiting. When her turn came, she didn't meet his argument with anger but with an authority that came from moral clarity. She spoke about fairness not as theory but as survival, about law not as protection for the powerful but as promise for the powerless. The ideological clash was unmistakable: establishment versus insurgency, theory versus truth, legacy versus progress. Dershowitz had built his reputation defending those with everything to lose, Crockett had built hers defending those with nothing left to lose. And in that tension between the man who had once defined the law and the woman now redefining justice lay the heartbeat of the confrontation that would soon explode across screens nationwide. Jasmine Crockett's story doesn't begin in marble halls or ivy-covered classrooms, it begins in courtrooms where the stakes were survival, not prestige. Before Congress, before the cameras, she was a public defender in Dallas, standing between the forgotten and a system that too often chewed people up. She learned early that justice wasn't blind, it was selective. And instead of accepting that, she made it her mission to challenge it. Every case she fought, every client she defended, carved a voice sharper than any textbook could craft. When she speaks, it's not theory, it's lived truth. Her power isn't just in her words but in the conviction behind them. She represents a generation that refuses to accept injustice as inevitable, a generation that has seen too much and stayed silent too little. Alan Dershowitz, on the other hand, rose from a different world entirely. The son of Brooklyn immigrants turned Harvard prodigy, he built his career on the edge of controversy. He defended the guilty to protect the principle that everyone deserves a defense, a stance once hailed as noble but now questioned for its moral flexibility. Over the years, his name became synonymous with courtroom brilliance and with defending the indefensible. To his admirers, he's a guardian of due process. To his critics, a man who mistook cleverness for conscience. Yet underneath the arrogance lies something more complicated, a deep need to preserve the legacy he built, even if it means standing alone against shifting tides. Two lawyers, two visions of justice. One forged in the fire of lived experience, the other in the sanctum of academia. Crockett's justice is human, it bleeds, breathes, and demands accountability. Dershowitz's is theoretical, a chess game of precedent and principle. He believes in the system because he helped build it. She questions it because she's seen who it fails. Their collision was never just about law, it was about truth itself, whether justice belongs to those who argue best or those who fight hardest for it. And on that night, beneath the glare of studio lights, their worlds didn't merely meet, they clashed, each carrying the weight of everything they stood for. It began hours before the cameras rolled. Network producers were already calling it a clash of legal titans. The promos flashed across social feeds, Alan Dershowitz versus Representative Jasmine Crockett, the debate you can't. Mississippi hashtags trended before a single word was spoken. Commentators speculated, fans chose sides, and the political corners of the internet braced for fireworks. Inside the studio, tension hummed like static. Producers scurried across the glossy floor, adjusting cameras, checking sound levels, rehearsing the open. The host rehearsed his lines under his breath, careful to sound neutral, knowing neutrality would evaporate the moment the debate began. The stage was designed for confrontation, two podiums, one spotlight between them, and a live audience hungry for conflict. In a pre-show interview, Dershowitz exuded his trademark confidence. "I look forward to educating Congresswoman Crockett on constitutional law," he said, his grin both polite and predatory. "We mustn't confuse passion with expertise." The comment made the rounds online within minutes. Headlines followed: Dershowitz prepares to school rising progressive star. His supporters loved it, his critics called it arrogance disguised as intellect. Jasmine Crockett, meanwhile, arrived quietly, no entourage, no theatrics. When reporters asked for her response to Dershowitz's jab, she smiled faintly. "I don't need to be educated," she said evenly. "I've lived what he lectures about." That line alone electrified her base. It wasn't boastful, just surgical, a preview of the calm confidence that would soon redefine the debate. As airtime approached, the tension became almost visible. In the control room, a producer whispered, "We might be witnessing a generational shift on live TV." In the makeup room, Crockett sat still as the stylist dusted her cheekbones. Across the hall, Dershowitz paced, rehearsing talking points, certain he'd command the conversation. Both understood what was at stake, but for very different reasons. When the countdown hit 60 seconds, the studio transformed. The lights dimmed except for the two bright circles framing their podiums. The host's voice cut through the buzz. Tonight, we bring together two brilliant legal minds to discuss the integrity of American justice. The first exchange was polite, almost deceptively so. Dershowitz opened with a lecture-like tone, quoting founding fathers, referencing obscure legal doctrines. It was his comfort zone, authority through complexity. He smiled often, occasionally glancing at Crockett with the air of a professor amused by a student's enthusiasm. She listened without flinching, jotting notes in a small pad, her calm in stark contrast to his performative bravado. The audience shifted uneasily, some impressed, others impatient. They didn't come for a lecture, they came for sparks. Crockett sensed it too. When she finally spoke, her tone was measured, her phrasing precise. She didn't match his volume, she matched his logic, point for point, but grounded every argument in lived reality. It's one thing to defend power from principle, she said softly, it's another to defend principle from power. The line drew a murmur from the audience, quiet but telling. Dershowitz chuckled, tilting his head as if indulging her. That's clever, he replied, but emotional arguments don't hold up in constitutional law. It was a subtle jab, an attempt to reassert hierarchy. He leaned back, confident the exchange had restored his upper hand. But the camera caught something, the faintest flicker in Crockett's eyes, a flash of steel beneath composure. She didn't interrupt. She didn't even respond right away. Instead, she waited, letting silence hang just long enough to make him uncomfortable. The host tried to pivot, but the moment lingered. Backstage, producers exchanged glances. The temperature in the room had changed. One whispered, "She's timing her strike." On social media, the debate had already gone viral mid-broadcast. Clips of his condescending tone circulated with captions like mansplaining on national TV. Others waited, commenting, "Can't wait for her to clap back." The storm was forming quietly, deliberately. The air in the studio thickened with expectation. Dershowitz didn't notice, he was too busy explaining, talking over the host, drowning in his own certainty. Crockett remained still, every gesture deliberate, every breath controlled. She wasn't reacting, she was preparing. By the time the host said, "Congresswoman, your response," the room seemed to hold its breath. Even the cameras felt closer, tighter. She straightened her posture, set down her pen, and met his eyes. The smirk on his face lingered a beat too long, long enough for everyone watching to sense what was coming. They didn't know it yet, but history was about to rewind itself in real time. What began as a clash of generations was moments away from becoming something else entirely, a televised turning point where power would learn what happens when intellect meets integrity under unblinking lights. Alan Dershowitz began as he always did, by taking command of the air itself. He straightened his tie, cleared his throat, and dove into a speech that sounded rehearsed but somehow effortless. "Let's be very clear," he said, leaning toward the camera as if addressing a courtroom of millions. "The Constitution is not a weapon for partisans. It's a shield for liberty. And those who twist it to score political points are, in fact, eroding the very justice they claim to protect." His voice carried the authority of decades spent lecturing students who scribbled his words as gospel. Jasmine Crockett didn't move. She watched him with the composure of someone who's seen bluster before and knows patience can be sharper than interruption. Her pen hovered just above her notepad, eyes fixed not in awe, but in assessment. Dershowitz continued, his confidence swelling with every sentence. "I've spent 60 years defending principles that transcend ideology," he said, his tone both grand and dismissive. "It's unfortunate that some in Congress, however well-intentioned, approach constitutional interpretation as if it's a matter of personal feeling rather than intellectual discipline." He didn't glance at her name, but the implication hung heavy. The host nodded politely, trying to move things along. "Congresswoman Crockett, your response." She smiled faintly, eyes still on Dershowitz. "Professor," she began softly, "with all due respect, principles don't transcend ideology when ideology is deciding who gets justice and who doesn't." The audience leaned in. Her voice wasn't loud, it didn't need to be. It carried the clarity of lived truth. Dershowitz chuckled, shaking his head. "You see, this is what I mean. You're conflating emotion with reason. Justice cannot be grounded in outrage. It must be grounded in law. You can't legislate based on what feels unfair, you legislate based on what's constitutional. She let the pause breathe. Then so you believe defending a man who tried to overturn democracy was constitutional? The tone wasn't angry, it was surgical. He blinked, caught between indignation and surprise. My role, he said carefully, was to ensure due process. Even the most unpopular defendant deserves representation. That's how our system works. Representation, sure, she said, tilting her head. But when you defend power so loudly that you drown out truth, it's not justice, it's theater. And the people paying the price aren't sitting in your classrooms, Professor. They're sitting in jail cells, wondering why the law protects power better than it protects them. A murmur rippled through the audience. The host opened his mouth, then closed it again. Dershowitz frowned. That's a very populist argument, Congresswoman, but it lacks sophistication. Law isn't about feelings or fairness, it's about structure. It's about ensuring the process remains intact, even when the results are uncomfortable. She leaned forward now, her tone tightening, not raised, but sharper. Structure means nothing when it's used to excuse corruption. Fairness isn't emotional, it's constitutional. The Equal Protection Clause doesn't care about your pedigree, it cares about consistency. And what you call sophistication, the rest of us call selective morality. Social media lit up instantly. Clips of her line selective morality flooded timelines. Commentators typed furiously, she's dismantling him with receipts. Dershowitz tried to regain footing. Congresswoman, I've been teaching law since before you were born. There are nuances you clearly, and that was the line. The one that snapped the air in half. Crockett didn't blink. And maybe that's the problem, she interrupted, calm but cold. You've been teaching it so long, you've forgotten what it's supposed to serve people. Not prestige, not power. People. The audience gasped. Even the host's practiced neutrality faltered. Dershowitz straightened in his chair, visibly irritated. You're turning this into an identity play, which undermines the intellectual integrity of this conversation. No, she said, cutting him off, I'm grounding it in reality. You defend systems, I defend people. Those systems fail. And when you lecture me about intellect, you're really just reminding us who you think deserves to speak and who doesn't. The silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was electric. Dershowitz opened his mouth, but for once, no words came. His face tightened, that professorial calm cracking under pressure. The host, sensing a moment, tried to pivot. Professor, would you like to respond? He exhaled sharply. Yes, I think this is exactly what's wrong with our discourse today. We've replaced reasoned debate with moral grandstanding. You can't shame your way into truth. Crockett smiled again, softer this time. You're right. You can't shame your way into truth. But you can sure expose hypocrisy trying to hide from it. Laughter and applause erupted. The host looked startled but didn't intervene. Dershowitz's jaw tightened, his usual eloquence deserted him. Let me ask you something, Professor, Crockett continued. When you stood on national television defending the indefensible, did you stop to think how it felt for Americans watching, Americans who still believe the law should mean something? Because every time we see the powerful bend the rules and walk away, people lose faith in the system you claim to protect. He shifted uncomfortably. I don't defend corruption, he said. I defend the Constitution. Then maybe, she replied, you should stop confusing one with the other. The line hit like a gavel. The studio fell silent for a full 5 seconds. Even the hum of the lights seemed to pause. Social media exploded. Hashtags like hashtag Crockett Clapback and hashtag Dershowitz defeated trended within minutes. Commentators clipped the exchange mid-broadcast, their captions reading, "This is what accountability sounds like." The host tried to steer the conversation back to policy, but the balance of power had shifted entirely. Dershowitz looked smaller now, not physically, but symbolically. The once unflappable professor found himself explaining, clarifying, backpedaling. Every word he spoke sounded like justification. Meanwhile, Crockett grew steadier. Her tone softened, but her points cut deeper. You talk about law as if it's separate from people, she said. But the law doesn't exist in a vacuum. It lives or dies through the people it protects. And right now, too many Americans feel unprotected. That's not outrage. That's evidence. The audience applauded again, longer this time. Dershowitz forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You're a good politician," he muttered. She leaned back, gaze unflinching. "No, Professor. I'm just not afraid of the truth." The host ended the segment moments later, thanking them both for a passionate exchange of ideas. But as the cameras panned out, the story was already being written. One side had argued the past, the other had spoken for the future. As the credits rolled, Dershowitz stared ahead, lips pressed tight. Crockett gathered her notes calmly, thanked the crew, and walked off set with the quiet assurance of someone who didn't need to declare victory because everyone watching had already done it for her. It happened in seconds, so fast that even the host missed the exact moment the current changed direction. 1 minute, Alan Dershowitz was in full command, his tone steeped in professorial confidence, the kind that could fill law school halls and Senate hearings alike. The next, something cracked, subtle but unmistakable. When Jasmine Crockett delivered the line, "Then maybe you should stop confusing." One with the other, it was as if the air left the studio. The words landed with the weight of a verdict, and for a heartbeat, no one moved. Then it happened. Dershowitz blinked. Just once, but it betrayed something: a flash of disbelief, a momentary loss of footing. The cadence that had once rolled so smoothly began to stutter. He reached for his notes, though he hadn't needed them all evening. His hand trembled slightly. The host leaned forward, perhaps to soften the blow, but even he knew, this was not a debate anymore. It was a reckoning. This, one producer would later say, was the exact second the internet exploded. Social media clips erupted in real time. Split-screen videos showed Dershowitz freezing mid-rebuttal while Crockett's composed expression said everything words didn't have to. Commentators exchanged stunned glances off-camera, their professional detachment slipping into quiet awe. Dershowitz tried to recover, forcing a smile. "Well, Congresswoman, I admire your passion, but let's stay within the boundaries of legal discourse." She didn't flinch. "The boundaries of legal discourse," she repeated softly, "are exactly what people like you draw to keep the rest of us out of the conversation." The host's eyes widened slightly. A camera operator mouthed, "Oh my God." Crockett didn't raise her voice, she didn't need to. Her calm became its own authority. Every syllable carried the gravity of conviction, uncoached and unfiltered. "You talk about process," she said, "but what you really defend is privilege. And privilege masquerading as principle has done more damage to this country than any protest you've ever criticized." The control room went silent except for the clicking of keyboards. Editors were already cutting the clip. The cheering at the bottom of the screen might as well have read Dershowitz versus Crockett and she's winning. Dershowitz opened his mouth again, but nothing he said afterward had the same resonance. His arguments sounded academic, procedural, sterile. The power dynamic had flipped entirely. Crockett wasn't responding to him anymore, she was addressing the audience, the people watching at home who felt, for once, that someone was speaking to them, not at them. You could feel the shift in her tone, calm but commanding, humble but unyielding. "I'm not here to win a debate," she said evenly. "I'm here because people deserve better than legal theater dressed up as justice." That was the moment the host looked directly at the camera, a reflex, perhaps, but one that betrayed awareness. He knew this was no longer a segment. It was a moment in history. On Twitter, posts flooded timelines. "This is how you dismantle arrogance with poise and truth." Dershowitz just met his match. Jasmine Crockett didn't just debate him, she redefined the arena. The studio, once a space of intellectual jousting, now felt more like a courtroom where the verdict was already unanimous. Dershowitz slumped slightly, his once commanding voice softening into polite defensiveness. He talked of context, nuance, history, but it all felt like static compared to the clarity radiating from Crockett's every word. And then came the coup de grace, not shouted, but delivered like a final exhibit. "You say justice must be blind," she said. "Maybe it's time it opened its eyes." The silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was reverent. The host exhaled audibly. One of the commentators whispered, "That's the clip that's going to live forever." In that instant, everyone in the room knew it, this was no longer Dershowitz's arena. The mentor had become the relic. The student, the future. As the show went to commercial, the cameras cut, but the energy didn't fade. The control room buzzed, phones lighting up with messages from producers, journalists, influencers. This was the exact second, one of them said again, replaying the footage on a monitor, that the internet crowned her. And it was true. The turning point wasn't just in tone or intellect, it was in power. Crockett hadn't raised her voice, but she'd raised the standard. Dershowitz, for all his decades of mastery, had been outmatched not by rage, but by reason. In 6 precise minutes, Jasmine Crockett had done what few manage in a lifetime. She didn't just win an argument. She shifted the narrative. What made Jasmine Crockett's performance unforgettable wasn't just the emotion, it was the evidence. Every word she spoke came armed with receipts, each one pulled like an exhibit in a courtroom where the jury was the nation itself. "Professor Dershowitz," she began, her tone measured but unyielding, "you keep invoking constitutional purity, but let's be honest, you've spent years redefining that purity to suit whoever happens to be in power." That single line opened the floodgates. As the clip replayed across networks, analysts began splicing it with archive footage. Dershowitz in 1998, fiercely arguing that a sitting president could be impeached for abuses of power, and then again in 2020, passionately claiming the exact opposite during Trump's trial. The contrast was surgical, devastating, undeniable. Crockett's mastery wasn't in mockery, it was in precision. "You said then," she continued, eyes locked on him, "no one is above the law, not even the president. Yet now, you say a president can do no wrong if he believes his actions are in the nation's interest. Which version of Alan Dershowitz should America trust?" The camera cut to Dershowitz, his mouth tightening, the faintest trace of discomfort in his usually confident posture. Legal analysts watching live could almost hear the collective gasp ripple through the legal community. Within minutes, constitutional scholars on X, formerly Twitter, were posting by side transcripts, underlining her words with citations. She's quoting Dershowitz's own Harvard Law Review article from 1998. "This is not a clapback, it's a deposition." Then came the next blow. Crockett leaned forward slightly, her voice calm but cutting through the noise. "You've said you defend principles, not people. Yet, somehow, the people you defend always seem to be the ones with power: Epstein, Trump, Netanyahu. Where are those principles when the powerless need the same protection?" It was the kind of line that didn't just sting, it rewrote the power balance. News anchors later described it as the moment she turned law into poetry. As Crockett spoke, her references were airtight. She cited the Federalist Papers, Article 2 of the Constitution, even specific rulings like United States versus Nixon, each one underscoring her point that the law was never meant to bend around ego. "The framers," she said, "didn't write the Constitution to protect men with power. They wrote it to protect the rest of us from them." Her grasp of history and law wasn't just impressive, it was strategic. Every citation was a brick laid in the foundation of her argument, until Dershowitz's towering rhetoric looked hollow by comparison. Producers intercut her points with archival clips, Dershowitz in glossy interviews defending powerful men under the guise of legal theory, Crockett standing outside courthouses, speaking to community members about police reform and voting rights. The visual contrast became the narrative itself. One built arguments to defend power, the other built power to defend people. After the broadcast, legal commentators flooded the airwaves. MSNBC's Ari Melber called it a constitutional clinic in real time. CNN's Van Jones described it as the most devastating cross-examination I've seen outside an actual courtroom. Even conservative commentators couldn't deny her preparation. "She came with evidence," one Fox analyst admitted. "He came with ego." Journalists compiled her arguments like case files. Her references to Federalist No. 51 about checks and balances began trending, with hashtags like #CrockettClinic and #Receipts for days. Law students clipped her lines into TikToks, explaining how she had just used Dershowitz's own scholarship to expose his contradictions. The receipts kept stacking up. In a post-show interview, Crockett clarified, "I respect Professor Dershowitz's experience. But experience means nothing if it isn't accountable to truth. We can't let the law become a weapon for the few when it was written to protect the many." The clip racked up millions of views within hours. One legal podcast titled its next episode, "The Day the Student Taught the Master." Another wrote, "What Crockett did tonight was more than debate, it was documentation. She didn't just speak truth to power, she cited it, sourced it, and footnoted it." By morning, the receipts had evolved into a movement. Lawyers, activists, and students began sharing their own Crockett receipts, facts, precedents, and cases challenging the misuse of power. It wasn't performative outrage. It was civic literacy in motion. Even Dershowitz, when asked later by a reporter if he regretted the exchange, gave a rare admission. "She's a very sharp lawyer," he said with a forced smile. "Maybe I underestimated her preparation." It wasn't just preparation. It was precision, integrity, and courage, the rare combination that turns a debate into a cultural turning point. Every argument Crockett made that night now lives on as a digital archive of accountability, not just proving Dershowitz wrong, but reminding a generation that the truth doesn't need to shout when it has evidence on its side. By dawn, the clip wasn't just trending, it was everywhere. Twitter threads dissected every frame, YouTube reaction videos multiplied by the hour. Within 12 hours, Jasmine Crockett's calm dismantling of Alan Dershowitz had crossed 10 million views. The caption that spread like wildfire read simply, "One woman. One truth. One viral reckoning." For many, it was more than entertainment, it was vindication. In classrooms and living rooms, people replayed the exchange, not to gawk, but to feel something rare, the satisfaction of watching arrogance meet accountability. Comment sections filled with gratitude and awe. "Finally," wrote one user, "someone said what we've all been screaming at our TVs for years." Another added, "She didn't just debate him, she educated him, and all of us." News anchors covered it like a cultural event. MSNBC called it, "the clapback heard across America." CNN dubbed it, "a generational correction." Even The Atlantic ran a headline that read, "Jasmine Crockett didn't just win, she redefined what winning looks like." But the most powerful reactions didn't come from pundits, they came from people. Law students posted emotional TikToks, some tearing up as they explained why her composure mattered. "We're told to respect authority, to defer to experience," one young black law student said. "But watching her, it reminded me that brilliance doesn't need permission." Another, from a small town in Texas, wrote, "I was ready to quit law school. Watching Jasmine tonight reminded me why I started to stand up for people who don't get airtime." Civil rights advocates amplified the moment, framing it as more than a televised debate, as a mirror of America's ongoing reckoning with power, privilege, and voice. "This is what happens when a new generation refuses to bow to the gatekeepers," tweeted journalist Joy Reid. "She didn't just hold her own, she shifted the room." Clips from the show became part of college lectures on media framing and gender bias. Professors paused the video at the exact moment Dershowitz faltered that half-second of visible discomfort to discuss what it meant for women challenging authority in public spaces. In community centers, activists screened the exchange as an example of composure under pressure. They spoke about how Crockett had mastered something deeper than rhetoric, the art of maintaining truth in a space designed to intimidate. "That's not just law," said one activist in Detroit. "That's leadership." As the clip spread globally, international outlets picked it up. The BBC called it, "a symbol of generational transition in American politics." In South Africa, a women's leadership group posted it with the caption, "Grace under fire is global." In India, law students began sharing translated snippets, tagging it #Crockett Effect. Meanwhile, Dershowitz's own legacy began to feel the tremor. Commentators debated whether his insistence on defending principle had finally backfired, that the professor who once shaped the moral debate was now being schooled in real time. The contrast couldn't have been sharper: Crockett's humility against his hubris, her clarity against his convolution. But the most profound impact wasn't reputational, it was psychological. For millions watching, it was the reminder that intellect and truth could still win in a world addicted to outrage. That you could confront power without losing grace. That you could be fierce without being cruel. Late that night, Crockett tweeted for the first time since the clip exploded, "We're not here to shout louder. We're here to stand firmer. Truth doesn't tremble." Within minutes, her words became a rallying cry, shared tens of thousands of times. By week's end, it was clear, this wasn't just a viral moment, it was a cultural pivot. The face of accountability had changed. The era of condescension cloaked as intellect was cracking. One woman had stood firm against establishment arrogance, and the world didn't just watch. It remembered. The fallout came fast and loud. By the next morning, Alan Dershowitz's phone was reportedly lighting up like a Christmas tree. Every major outlet wanted a response, and every late-night host wanted a punchline. The moment became shorthand for a broader truth that intellect without empathy is hollow, and authority without humility will always crumble under the weight of its own certainty. In the end, it wasn't just Jasmine Crockett's win. It was a collective victory for every voice ever talked over, every truth ever dismissed. And that legacy, unlike fame, doesn't fade. Moments like this don't happen every day. They're rare, the kind that make you sit forward, rewind, and realize you just witnessed a shift in the culture. When truth stands tall against arrogance, when courage refuses to bow to ego, that's more than television. That's transformation. If you believe in reason over rhetoric, in facts over fear, in courage over condescension, you belong here. This channel isn't just about watching the news unfold. It's about understanding it, challenging it, and standing with those who dare to speak when silence is safer. Don't just scroll past history as it happens. Be part of the movement that's redefining what accountability looks like in America. Because when the next clash comes, and it will, you'll want to be here, in this community, watching it unfold in real time. So hit like. Subscribe. Turn on notifications. Stay connected to the stories that matter, the ones that remind us truth still has a voice, and it sounds a lot like justice. When truth meets arrogance, it doesn't always shout. Sometimes it arrives softly, calm, clear, and devastatingly precise. That night, Jasmine Crockett didn't just win an argument, she restored faith in what integrity looks like when it stands its ground. Her words cut through decades of noise, reminding America that intellect without conscience is just performance. As the credits rolled and the studio lights dimmed, the echo of her final line lingered, not as applause, but as silence thick with recognition. Across millions of screens, viewers sat still, processing what they had just witnessed. It wasn't spectacle. It was substance. It was proof that truth, when spoken with conviction, doesn't need to dominate the room, it defines it. Long after the broadcast ended, that image remained, Crockett, composed and unwavering under the glare of studio light, while arrogance shrank in the shadow of accountability. History doesn't always announce itself with fanfare. Sometimes, it looks like one woman refusing to be belittled, and in doing so, changing the tone of an entire conversation. Because in that moment, justice didn't whisper. It resonated.